The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Hear how an entire town and school system was founded around these concepts by a woman in the 1860s. You're listening to Courage, Stories of Everyday Hope. Fort Monroe is built along the Chesapeake Bay and Atlantic Ocean. Sitting next to the largest deepwater port on the eastern coast of the United States, it was a military outpost that's importance in America is belied by its small size. Fort Monroe was built over a 15-year period. A young military civil engineer, Robert E. Lee, had a heavy hand in its design and construction. Little did he know, 30 years after his posting there, he would be locked in a battle against it and for the soul and freedoms of millions. During the Civil War, it is difficult to impress upon a modern audience used to driving 6 hours for a concert or flying several thousand miles for a wedding how close everyone was. Fort Monroe was across a 7-mile deepwater bay, the Hampton Roads, from the then called Gosport Shipyard. Now it's called the Norfolk Navy Yard. Norfolk voted to secede from the Union, and instead of holding strong, Charles Stewart Macaulay ordered the burning of that shipyard and the evacuation of all of its personnel across the water to Fort Monroe. This fire only put a small pause on the Confederates' presence there, who were able to quickly rebuild the shipyards and start building the first of the ironclads. So imagine this, 2 opposing armies with the freedom of a nation in their scopes sat separated by just 7 miles of ocean. It was a quiet spring night, May 23rd, 1861, and 3 men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, had an audacious plan: escape to Fort Monroe by rowing a tiny skiff across those 7 miles of the Chesapeake Bay in the dark of night. The very next morning, Fort Monroe's commander, Major General Benjamin Butler, met with them at Quarters 1 and learned that these enslaved men were going to be used to build Confederate fortifications. Mallory's emissary, Major John B. Carey, demanded that the runaways be returned in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act. Prior to the war, slave owners could legally request their return as property under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Instead of bowing to peer pressure, Colonel Charles pondered, and 4 days later, on May 27th, Butler met with Major Carey and asserted that because the Confederate Virginia now claimed to be a foreign country, that laws no longer applied, that these 3 slaves were now contraband of war and would not be returned to bondage. Malicious compliance much? They're now spoils of war, and who would want to return spoils of war to the enemy? News of this extraordinary development spread, and Fort Monroe received the nickname the Freedom Fortress. And guess what? Hundreds of African-American escapees streamed into the area around Fort Monroe. Hundreds grew to thousands. Inspired by Colonel Mallory, the United States government acted swiftly to pass his interpretation of the law. Introduced into the Senate as S-25 on July 15th in 1861, it passed the Senate on July 22nd, 1861, passed the House with an amendment on August 3rd, 1861. The Senate agreed to the House amendment 2 days later on August 5th, and it was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln on August 6th, 1861. Just 49 days, 7 weeks, Congress was activated and changed how laws were and freedom was interpreted nationally. And in a prime example of how male leadership obviously doesn't fall prey to their emotions, I'm being very sarcastic.
History began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake.
The Confederates of Hampton, Virginia, a city less than 2 miles from Fort Monroe, decided that if they can't have control of the city and their slaves, I guess no one else can, and they burnt most of the city down on August 2nd, 1861, while the white families fled to Richmond and Norfolk. Now, 3 days later, on August 10th, 1861, the first use of the phrase contraband referring to escaped slaves was used in official naval correspondence, when Acting Master William Budd of the gunboat USS Resolute used the term. The small 565-acre peninsula where Fort Monroe was placed then became a beacon of hope. And these people didn't sit idly by. They organized. Tent cities popped up on the smoking ashes of Hampton. Roads were named, and a flourishing community of freed slaves realized it was their right to demand the same access to services as their white brethren. Hampton's census in 1860 had counted a total population of 1,848. Just 4 years later, more than 10,000 newly emancipated African Americans lived in the area surrounding Fort Monroe. Historian Robert F. Ings, author of Freedom's First Fortress, Black Hampton, Virginia, 1861 to 1890, said, "This risk-taking resettlement was the first mass freedom incident of the Civil War and the beginning of freedom for all Americans. It was also at Fort Monroe that many African-American spirituals, one of the richest aspects of American culture, were transcribed for the very first time. They also started building houses for themselves, naming streets, submitting names of people to run city services. And one woman wanted something big for them all. She wanted to teach them." Mary Smith Peake was born in 1823 to a free Black woman in Norfolk, Virginia, and received her education outside of Washington, D.C. She then moved to Hampton with her husband in 1847. Supporting herself as a dressmaker, she secretly began teaching African Americans, both free and enslaved out of her home, men and women. But why in secret? Well, in retaliation for Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, many states passed laws that barred free and enslaved Black people from learning to read or write. By the time Peake was 16, she returned to Virginia, where it was now illegal for free Black people to meet for purposes of obtaining an education. Retaliatory laws also made it illegal to conduct schools for African Americans taught by African Americans.
Huh?
By getting books and seats and welcoming people into her home, she was willfully defying the law and teaching people to read, write, mathematics, and understand the laws and rights that they too should hold. After the Confederates left the smoldering pile of Hampton, Virginia, Mary's fine home included, by the way, word spread of the growing sea of people at Fort Monroe, and missionary associations sent people from the north down to assist these refugees, now called contrabands. On the 17th of September, 1861, just 41 days after the contraband laws were passed, the first school to educate African Americans was founded. And who was hired to be the first teacher? Undercover secret agent rabble-rouser Mary Peake herself. And in an ultra-flex moment, she refused to accept a salary.
What, like it's hard?
On a cool fall morning, she gathered with 6 students under an oak tree to start her lessons. There was no school building for their comfort, but it was bravely out in the open. Her school blossomed to more than 50 students in a matter of days. This was still illegal, but everyone knew that just because something is a law doesn't always make it just, fair, or correct. Soon they relocated to a house near the Chesapeake Female Seminary, and classes met on the first floor. Mary and her husband and daughter lived above on the second floor. During the daytime, Mary taught the younger ones, and I cannot imagine how wonderful it would have felt to experience representation for the very first time. This well-dressed, intelligent, beautiful Black woman sat down with them to show them a future outside of plantations, oppression, and tent camps. In the evening, a class of around 20 adults, most of who arrived wholly illiterate, met in her hallowed halls to study not just how to read, but how to understand the meaning behind the written word, the inner power of self-direction, and the vital knowledge that they have the power and capabilities to self-direct their own lives. She also helped representatives from the American Missionary Association begin schools in Newport News and Norfolk. By 1862, about 500 students had attended association schools where Peake and others had taught, the very first schools in the South in which African American teachers educated large numbers of African Americans, members of the community helping their own community. Tuberculosis was a scourge of the era. In the 1800s, 1 in 4 deaths was caused by this airborne killer. And at some point in her life, Mary caught the feared disease. Now, this might be me projecting. As a fellow woman with a chronic illness, I understand that inner voice saying, I might be hurting today, but the cause is greater than my suffering, and I will not stop. Mary ignored all the advice from others to slow down and rest, and she insisted that she must help her people until her dying breath. And she, a woman of fearless strength, did just that. A little over 5 months after bringing her secret underground schools into the bright sunshine under a strong oak tree, Mary Smith Peake died of tuberculosis on the night of the 22nd of February, 1862, and was buried in Elmerton Cemetery in Hampton, where she was remembered with a gravestone inscription as the first teacher of the freed men at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, when she was just 39 years old. She was buried fittingly under an oak tree in the presence of her students. Her school is considered a precursor of Hampton University, and both a school and a street in Hampton are also named for her. Hampton University, at the close of its first decade, reported a total admission of 927 students, with 277 graduates, all but 17 of whom had become teachers. Many of them had also bought land and established themselves homes. Many were farming as well as teaching. Some had gone into business, but only a very small portion failed to do well. By another 10 years, there had been over 600 graduates. In 1888, of the 537 graduates still alive, 3/4 were teaching, and about half as many undergraduates were also teaching. It was estimated that 15,000 children in community schools were being taught by Hampton students and alumni that year. The list of world-changing students who attend Hampton University is fantastically long. I suggest you one day go take a look at the amount of good that this university system has created over the years. And while researching this episode, I learned that Hampton is the first and only HBCU to have a 100% control of a NASA mission. From under an oak tree to the actual stars. Mary's ripple in a pond is still being felt today. In 1863, the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation in the South was read. Where? Under Mary's giant oak. It was renamed the Emancipation Oak, and it stands to this day as a reminder to us all. I'd like to think that it was a student of hers that got to read those powerful words, and they spoke them in her honor that day. Sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking a few laws, ignoring well-meaning naysayers, and standing up, even when others are too scared to do that. And that, to me, is courage. This has been a Doculite production. My name is Lacie Madison. You've been watching Courage, Stories of Everyday Hope. Thank you so much for liking, subscribing, and supporting us on all platforms. You really do make a difference. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.